Double blind and blind tasting, is it actually useful or is it just a parlor trick?
Look, I mean, anyone can taste, anyone can say, I like this more than that, but how much context do you have? This was back in the day when I could buy that in our market for under $20 a bottle. Now that
Oof.
same wine is probably three times that, if not a little bit more.
Tell me a little bit more about transitioning, obviously, from writing critic to actually starting to produce some wine too.
Yes, I can. Don't do it.
These top producers, they just got tons of character.
Sometimes too much character.
Yeah. This podcast is with my friend, Master Sommelier John Szabo, one of only two Master Sommeliers in Canada. He's known for authoring the book Volcanic Wines, Power, Salt, and Grit. He also runs a Volcanic Wine Summit. I've been to it in New York back in 2018. He's also one of the most impressive tasters that I've ever tasted with. He's also a main contributor to Wine Line. He's always been super kind to me. And I first came across him when Wine Line was producing this YouTube show called So You Think You Know Wine. It was shot poker style around the table where Canadian wine professionals were double blind tasting wines and trying to analyze them. I remember seeing him on the show and saying, wow, he's a really impressive taster. Years later, when I met him, I started tasting with him. I said, wow, he is a damn impressive taster. One of the best tasters that I've ever tasted with. But without further ado, let's get to the podcast. For volcanic wines, why are they so special? What actually makes them unique besides the cool geography?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question right off the top because we just published, we being myself and a professor of chemistry from Montreal and another professor from Dijon University, we did a study with the Auvergne region in France, where there's a whole bunch of basalts and limestone in the same region, literally side by side in some cases, and one main grape, which is Gamay. And over a couple of years, we did a study comparing Gamay grown on basalt versus Gamay grown on limestone, and we came up with some pretty interesting results. You know, some, I would say, scientifically rigorous distinctions between the two. Not that one is better than the other, but for example, the pH in the basalt grown Gamay was always a little bit higher than the limestone. The color was always a little bit more on the reddish yellow end of the spectrum versus the more purplish red of the limestone. So a couple of little chemical differences that are attributed only to the soil because the wines were made in all the same way.
Now, just to clarify for people that understand, does the rule still ring true in volcanic wines where like a higher pH in the soil is going to equal lower pH in the wines, which obviously means the wines are going to have more acidity?
I mean, that's a complex chemical question that perhaps I'm not qualified to answer. There is a relationship between soil pH and wine pH, but it's not linear, it's not direct, it's not easy.
And why do maybe it is just completely the placebo effect, confirmation bias, but I do feel like when I drink volcanic wines, I get this mineral grittiness. I mean, you're the author of a cool book, great book, Volcanic Wines, Power, Salt, and Grit. How do actually those flavors get transmitted into the wine? Because obviously we know that minerals just don't go up through the root systems and end up in the wine. Why do the wines have that sharp, gritty flavor?
I mean, as you know, in the world of wine, nothing is ever simple and relationships are not direct. But by and large, if I could speak broadly about volcanic soils, they have a really wide range of mineral elements. I mean, they're pretty rich in all sorts of things. Iron, magnesium, potassium is usually very high, and many others. And so the vine gets a pretty broad diet of all these minerals. But the other thing is that for the most part, at least where the best volcanic wines are grown, the soils are pretty young. That is, they're pretty rocky. They don't hold a lot of water. So the vines actually struggle. They can access these minerals, but if they're not diluted in water, dissolved in water to be taken up by the root system, then they can't access them. So they get little bits and pieces. I call it, a sort of broad diet, but a restricted calorie diet. And then you end up with these smaller bunches of grapes, thicker skins, more concentrated juice, which contains a lot of these mineral elements. And there are a couple of instances where we can make a direct relationship between, say, potassium in soils. Basalt has a lot of potassium. We've been in Hungary together, say on the north shores of Lake Balaton. Some wonderful wines are made there, but they're always quite high in pH because there's a lot of potassium in the soil, and potassium is an acid buffer, technically speaking. So it actually drives the pH up. And you see this not just in Hungary, but in Lake County, for example, loads of volcanic regions there, volcanic vineyards, same sort of phenomenon.
It, you've been doing this. How long have you been in wine now for? You've been
In
you're a
wine,
veteran.
good part of a quarter of a century.
So obviously you've been around the block. You know what happens in the cellar. Like I start as I get more into this world. I always feel I start to shift more towards producer than region. But there's something weird about volcanic terroir. Like even when I'm in the regions, you do deep dives and there's lesser known producers or producers that maybe don't have the pedigree, but the volcanicness just shows through the wines. Do you feel like is my observations correct? Do you feel like you have the same assumptions?
Yeah, I mean, producer still matters quite a lot, certainly when it comes to quality. But there are some regions where no matter what you do, the volcanicness seems to come through. I'll give you an example. I was in Naples earlier this year, in a region called the Campi Flegrei, literally the fields of fire, where I had been there 10 years or so ago researching the book. There were 2 or 3 good wines, good producers, not much else. This time around, there were 3 or 4 times that number of good producers, and they all had this sort of consistent, I'm going to call it salinity. I know we're right next to the sea, and that matters as well. I mean, you do get garden variety sodium chloride from salty sea air that deposits on the grapes, but beyond that, I'm fully under the impression that there's also other mineral salts, magnesium salts, potassium salts, that give this kind of salty character. So it doesn't really matter what you do in the winery. The wine could be terrible, but there's still going to be this kind of salty, gritty character that that you can't avoid.
That was at Campagna Stories when I saw you last, right? Was that when
Yes.
you were last at Camp? I
Yeah.
was really impressed when I had dinner with a lot of producers on the one of the volcanoes, the crater lakes there,
Hmm.
and I was shocked by a lot of these producers were fairly new bottling, and there were some brilliant wines there. Like the Falangina really tastes distinctive there.
Yeah. Well, it's a different Falangina. We don't need to get into the
Yeah.
distinctions of different Falangina biotypes, but yeah, I'm a big fan of those wines.
Let's get a little more granular. We're talking about regions a little bit. I know it's hard to kind of choose. I hate when people say, "What's your favorite wine or the best wine?" I like to ask when I ask people what they're the most memorable wine. Your book is super extensive. I don't own a copy, but I've read it because I've seen it all over the place. But what are the memorable regions for you? Of course, every place is special and unique and have producers. But for people out there, what regions are memorable to you and maybe that they should really pay attention to?
Can I make just a quick plug on the book?
Oh,
If
of
anyone
course you can.
if
Of
anyone's
course you
looking
can.
for it, and you can look it up on Amazon. It's been out of print now for a few years, sold
Yes.
out from the original run. I've seen it going for absurd prices. I've seen it
Yes.
1,000 euros, 1,500 euros for a used copy. Good news is that I'm reissuing the original edition, but in ebook format and also paperback.
Oh, I'm
So
gonna. I will put a link. When's that gonna be out? I'll put a link in the description box.
my partner's working on the final touches now. Just have to do a couple of re-edits to get it into ebook format. It should be hopefully before the end of the year.
Great. I'll have a copy. All right. but
I'll
but
post it on my Instagram account when it's finally out, but you'll be able to find it, pretty much anywhere, Amazon, Kindle. And yeah,
okay.
sorry for the little plug,
No,
but somebody might be
that's
interested
perfect. That's perfect because I think people should read it. So, or just flip through it because the pictures and the images are beautiful too. What are some of those memorable regions that really stick out to you? Stuff that people should pay attention to. Oh, because we forget a lot of times in the wine world. You and I, us geeks, get so excited about. That's why I wanted to work retail. When I'm in the writers world, everything's great. Growing the small producers, these, making 5,000 bottles a year of this cuvee, everything's great. The landscape's great. But at the end of the day, are these wines super well distributed? And what are most people drinking? There's that big gap.
two
But
very different questions.
yeah, exactly. But going backtracking a little bit, what are some memorable regions for you, stuff that people might be able to seek out and find?
So, one of the regions, for example, that actually inspired the book in the first place was Santorini.
Mm,
And you've been to Santorini, and it's a pretty pretty magical place. And I remember the first time I tasted an Assyrtiko from Santorini, I literally almost fell over. This was a number of years ago in Toronto. An importer just started up a company specializing in Greek wines. Somehow got my email, sent me an invitation. I said, I don't know anything about Greek wines. Let's go have a look. First wine I tasted when I walked into the room was Iea Thalasitis.
Yeah.
Fantastic wine from Yannis Paraskevopoulos. But I had never seen this grape, never tasted it. First sip of that, I was like speechless. I stopped there in my try. I said to the guy pouring it, what is this? Where is it from? This is the most, I can't say the best wine I've tasted, but certainly one of the most unusual wines, one of those wines that stops you completely in your tracks. And I mean, it was a few years after that I finally got to Santorini, but fell in love with the place, the magic of the wines, not just the wines themselves, but the place. So, I mean, if you haven't tasted Assyrtiko from Santorini, do so. Find it. You'll find a bunch in the U.S. Number of, there are only, about a dozen producers, maybe more. So there's not a whole lot to know. And the production is not high, as you know. I mean, yields.
And they're not cheap anymore. They just keep rising in price.
This was back in the day when I could buy that in our market for under $20 a bottle. Now that same wine is probably 3 times that, if not a little bit more. But well worth it. And if that means saving Santorini from another ship dock and another hotel, which the island can't handle, the infrastructure is already at breaking point. I mean, I'll buy that as sort of safeguarding a world patrimony. Been growing and making wine for 3,000 years.
Before you go to another region, I just want to touch back on this. You first tasted that when? What year did you first taste the
That would be somewhere in the mid 2000s, I would say.
Wow, so you were already a master sommelier, correct? So this is an important point, how diverse the world of wine is, because I see this people all the time. People think that just a wine expert, if you're a master sommelier, if you're a master wine, you should know everything about all parts of wine, but it's pretty darn impossible, I think.
Yeah, it'd be foolish to even think that you could get to that point. If you think that at any point, then you've lost the plot.
Okay.
I mean, the one thing we always say is, passing a test like the MS or the MW, never an end. It's just the beginning, and that's when you realize that you'll never know everything.
Good point. So we got us, and it's so funny because I've been to every great region of Europe, plus all the exotic regions. I think besides Ukraine, I still haven't been to Madeira, Jerez. Those are like the last 3 on my list. But also, I haven't been to Greece. I love Greek wines to death, and I have not been to Greece yet. I got to make it. I haven't been to North Macedonia, but now all the Balkans. But for some reason, I haven't been to Greece. So
we can make that happen. I know some people.
All right, thanks. Great. Let's besides Greek Assyrtiko from Santorini, which I'm a huge fan of. I love those wines. I've got some Amphora Assyrtikos in my cellar, actually, by Selipos. But what are some other regions that really get you excited, get your gears grinding, get your gears going?
Well, I tell you, another wine that I knew nothing about and tasted for the first time here in Toronto. I was buying wine for a group of Italian restaurants, and an importer rolls in with a bottle of wine from a place called Etna. And again, this was back in the mid 2000s, before Etna became what it is today. And we tasted it together. He knew nothing about it. I knew nothing about it. And again, my God, there's something here. How much is this wine? He said, I think it's like $20. I said, how much did you bring in? I'll take it all. So I bought the entire allocation. That was Terrenere.
It's Terrenere. Okay, yeah.
Terrenere, just their basic Etna Rosso. I think
brilliant wine still.
Yeah, it's now a little bit more expensive, but I mean, Mark de Grazia is making fabulous wines. So again, it took me a couple of years, but I finally made my way to Etna and was, absolutely fascinated by the history of that mountain, how, the vineyards were more or less abandoned for much of the 20th century. And the story is always the same. Grandfather made wine, son went off to be a lawyer in Milano or do something else. And now the grandson has come back, taken over the family property, and started to make some pretty interesting wines from these ancient vines that, somehow survived even when they weren't really farmed. And obviously the reputation has grown to heights now, and the top wines are not inexpensive. But utterly distinct and unique. Nerello Mascalese for me is a wonderful variety. You can see why it wasn't popular back in the 90s or the 80s when everyone was looking for big, powerful Parker style red wines. But now it just hits the zeitgeist perfectly. A little paler in color, a little higher in acid, a little more perfumed. Drink it with a
Still
little
have
chill.
those Italian tannins, still got those biting tannins. And
I mean, you still need a little, fatty protein as you're sitting and drinking one of those. But
so you guys set me straight on Etna here. So when I lived in Singapore, I remember the favorite importer. She was a great importer. She brought in all this. She brought in a bottle of Tenuta de Ficina Musmeci, the Etna Rosso Riserva, and that just blew my mind completely. It was perfumed. It was Burgundian, okay, so to speak. And it made me want to go to Etna. So the first time I went to Etna, I was just a consumer. I was just a tourist. And since then, I've been back in a professional manner a couple of times. I find two things. I find this is what you have to set me straight on. I find it to be one of the most hauntingly beautiful regions because you have all those abandoned villas, all these old vines. You have, producers keep pushing the limits of altitude. So that's really romantic. But on the flip side, my biggest criticism is the Contrada system, where they're trying to make Burgundy and they're trying to charge really pretty obscene prices for the Contradas when I like the base blends a lot more sometimes. Because Etna was kind of a bulk wine region for a long time, like these 100-year-old, and you're trying to convert them to make Burgundy style or quality wines in terms of price. I don't know. That's my opinion. I need you to set me straight on this.
lots of different directions I could go with that one. I mean, first of all, I'll say that yes, there are quite a lot of differences even within a relatively small area. It's actually not that small, but I mean, you mentioned elevation being a key thing. The grapes you grow at 500 meters are not the same as what you grow at 900 meters or 1,000 meters. And then think of how active Etna is, how many times different flows of lava have come down the mountain, different age of soils, different degree of rockiness, stoniness, or relative fertility. So are there differences? Of course. Are those reflected in the grapes? Yes. The Contrada system, I mean, it's confusing to many because the word Contrada is actually used in different ways in different parts of Italy. Generally or historically, it meant sort of an agglomeration of agricultural holdings, kind of like a little mini district, if you will. But in some other parts of Italy, it's a quartier of a town. You go to Siena, there's different contradas, nothing to do with agriculture. So I understand why people are confused. I'm still a little bit confused, to be perfectly honest. But I do appreciate the movement in the industry to start to. It's a beginning. To define these differences that we know exist. Is it perfect? Of course not. But for that matter, even the Burgundian system is not perfect. What was Grand Cru 50 years ago, today maybe not so Grand Cru. As climate warms, do I want the perfectly exposed west-facing hillside, south-facing? No. I might want to go to the Haute Côte, which 50 years ago would have been undrinkable, thin acidic wine. Today, beautiful, haunting perfume like we look for in great Burgundy.
I also, set me straight on this. Everybody is so huge on Kante, and I've tasted some great ones, especially some with age. But some of the iconic bottlings, I've tasted a lot. You've got more breadth and depth, but I have managed to taste probably all the icons. And I find Kante sometimes, especially when it's young, to be just completely not exciting. Austere and acid water. I have tasted some spellbinding examples. Obviously, when they age, and some producers when young, I was really impressed with. But I don't know. I'm still not convinced. You guys set me straight on this too.
No, maybe you'll never be a Kante lover. I mean, it's not my job to convince you.
Yeah.
I have a lot of time for the grape, and I think you're dead right when you say a little bit of age. I mean, let's face it, young white wine straight out of the vat, they all kind of taste a little similar, a little higher acid, a little lower acid, but they haven't developed much character. Kante is one of those grapes that absolutely needs time. And, if you've tasted the grapes, you've tasted old Pietra Marina from Benante, you've tasted old Barone di Villagrande. I mean, I was at Etna Days kind of similar to Companion Stories back in September. So I'm tasting all of the young vintages. And having had the experience of tasting older vintages, you can see in some of these young wines future greatness, but none of them were even remotely close to drinking. But I mean, I had some absolutely glorious examples of wines that I know in 5-6 years are going to be stunners.
I would be remiss if I didn't talk about a country that we love. You have roots there, and has volcanic soils, Hungary. I have been in love with Hungary ever since I first backpacked through the country back when I was in graduate school to when I started to get into wines. I love Tokaj. To me, is maybe the greatest wine in the world. Maybe for me personally, for my palate. Let's talk about Hungary and why it's weird. When I was working on my Hungarian wine book, again, another thing that you helped me with, you wrote a quote, even though I was launching a Kickstarter, it kind of failed publicly. I was a little bit embarrassed, but you were still helpful in that. But you talked about how it's weird because it's one of these historical wine countries that's still not really that well known. I mean, the 17th century was just France, Germany, and Tokaj. That was like it.
Yeah.
Why? And you have roots there. You speak some Hungarian. Why do you feel like it really doesn't get the recognition that it deserves?
I think it's mainly a structural issue. It's not that great wines haven't or aren't made. There's some brilliant stuff, as you know. But I mean, I'm not going to get into too much of the history. There was that little period under communist rule where everything was collectivized. And during that period, it was never about quality. It was always about supplying the command economy, right? The vast market that included all the Soviet countries. So, it's no wonder the world forgot about Hungarian wines at that point. And it's been since 1991, really, that things have gotten back on track, at least in terms of quality wine production. But there hasn't been, until quite recently, the marketing behind it. And the comparison I always draw is with Austria. I mean, the Austrian Wine Marketing Board, for me, one of the most
they're the benchmark, right? They're the benchmark in that part of Europe.
They're brilliant. I think everyone should kind of model after what they do. But Hungary never had that. Finally, now they've got a marketing agency that's part of the Ministry of Agriculture, the government. So there's some clever people, and I know many of them behind that organization, who are on track to do the right thing to put Hungary on the map. So it's exciting. I think there's a whole other country that most people don't know out there with a great history that is making great wines that people will start to hear a little bit more about.
Well, I think, two things. I just judged at the Asia Wine Trophy in Korea. I just got back last month. And the guest of honor, there's also in conjunction with a wine show. And the guest of honor country that year was Hungary. So it was great because I got to see some old friends and the producers. It was awesome to see the Koreans being introduced to these wonderful wines. But I think what I've been fascinated with Hungary is when I was going through it, I almost feel like Kermit Lynch in a way. God, there's just so many of these small guys. It's hard to find. And I've spent, my wine career started in Eastern Europe, some of these odd countries. And sometimes when producers just they're still, even though they're kind of old world, ancient world, I know that term's outdated, they're still new world because they're brand new. They just started learning. And sometimes the wines don't really have character. But the ones in Hungary, man, especially these top producers, they just got tons of character. I think that's why I'm in love with the country. They're
sometimes too much character.
Yeah, right, you're right. In the case of Shovel, are there any styles or regions people should pay attention to? I push Hungarian wines all the time. I shout from the mountains because I love them to death. But any kind of personal favorites in that country for you in terms of styles?
Across the whole northern stretch of the country, which is the most volcanic part. I mean, starting in Lake Balaton, where you've been, beautiful lake, the Hungarian Sea, as we call it. On the north shore, you've got this beautiful landscape, which is just a series of old volcanoes, 50 or 60 little mountain tops with these flat tops, really unique. Actually, even in the world of volcanic wines, these monadnocks, as they're technically called, mostly basalt of varying ages, producing some really, really sharp white wines. And one grape, it's going to be hard to track down, but I love Kéknyelű.
And I love the pronunciation.
blue stock, but it's one of these ancient varieties, so ancient in fact that it's not hermaphrodite. It doesn't pollinate itself, so you have to plant it next to another variety that flowers at about the same time, so that the cake leaf flowers pollinate and turn into grapes. So it's complicated as a grower. I can see why it was almost abandoned, and there's still not a lot of it, maybe 40, 50 hectares planted and only in that region. But if you can track it down, I mean, this is like, for me, the volcanic essence of the volcanic essences.
How long have you been a master sommelier now for?
2004.
Did you even work?
20
Did
years.
you work on the? Did you work on the floor ever before? I don't even kind of know your backstory really.
I did work in restaurants, yes, but funnily enough, I spent more time in the kitchen than I did on the floor. I did spend time on the floor serving and as a sommelier, but I worked for 4 or 5 years in kitchens here in Toronto and down in Niagara and wine country. I was exposed to wine. I used to go over to the winery side of the estate that I was working on and chat with the winemaker and actually help out with some winemaking from time to time. And ended up in France, worked there in a couple of restaurants in Paris. And, being so interested in wine, or growing my interest in wine, I did a wine course while I was there. So that was kind of how I got started into wine, and then came back and did a bunch of things here in Toronto. Did some importing for a while, did some catering, worked in restaurants, and then passed in 2004 and kind of got into writing right around that time as well.
Well, you passed before the whole Somm film craze and before Somm became a sexy thing, especially being a master Somm. I think a lot of people ask, I noticed in the comments and stuff, is how tough was the blind tasting exam and that?
It's the one piece of that three-legged exam that freaks everyone out, because it's the one you can't really control. I mean,
Yeah.
The theory, the knowledge, you study that, you put in the time, and if you have a decent memory, eventually you'll get there. But the blind tasting, so many other factors come in. How do you feel on the day? The first time I went for the advanced, which was in England, I caught a little cold on the flight over, and I was freaking out. I went to all sorts of pharmacies to get whatever medicines I could to open up my nasal passageway. But little things like that you can't control necessarily is what makes that part of the exam particularly tough. And you need a little bit of luck. Let's be honest. If it's a series of wines that you're intimately familiar with, well, then chances of passing are pretty good. But every once in a while you come across something and you're like, Jesus, what is that? I can describe it, and it's not just about guessing the grape and the region, etc. It's about describing how the wine is, but you still need to guess enough of them to pass.
Do you think that it would be more difficult these days than maybe, I don't know when, I don't even know when the CMS was founded. I know I've heard of it before, but I can't remember the actual year. Since the world of the wine has become so diverse and everybody's making high quality wines, do you feel like it'd be harder to pass than maybe 20, 30 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about that and laugh about it often, not just in Court of Master Sommeliers, but Masters of Wine. If you passed in 1978, then there was Burgundy and there was Bordeaux and there was Port and Champagne and Northern Rhone, maybe a couple of others, and the world of wine was pretty limited. Today, man, there's a lot of wine, a lot of good wine made in so many different parts of the world that
I first came across you, first knew about you from your writing, and then when you guys were producing that video series, So You Think You Know Wine, which us wine geeks went nuts over. You can see it in the comments. And I remember then tasting with you a couple years later, like 5, 6 years later, and I was like, wow, because you were the most impressive taster I thought in the show, and then tasting with you in person, I was super impressed. Like, can you talk a little bit about your experience on that show? It was super well shot, well produced. It was very entertaining, especially for wine nerds.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. And yeah, I bump into people in various parts of the world say, "Oh, you're that guy from Think You Know Wine." It was a show that, I mean, actually the concept came about while we were having a little Christmas dinner party at a restaurant back when there were only 4 of us in Wine-A-Line. And I brought some wine, and David Lawson brought some wine, and we decided to taste it blind. And the CEO of the company, Brian McCaw, was there at the table, and David and I are tasting these wines blind. And Brian says, "That's really kind of interesting to listen to you describe the wine, guess the wine." And from there, this idea that, okay, well, let's try sharing this with our readers as well. So we shot, actually, 10 or 11 seasons. By that we mean we used to run it as a competition. You'd start with a round robin, and those who would earn enough points would move on to a final round, and then you'd sit around a table. It's kind of shot like a poker scene. We had a host.
Yeah, exactly. Cinematic. It was well produced. I do mostly blind tastings on my show. It's so funny because I was just with a master of wine, and she's like, "Do you ever cheat?" Wink, wink. And I said, "There's no point. Why? Like, there's no point." But because in my videos, I'm super honest. I've had $15 wines beat $300 wines. What I remember when before I got into the industry, like real hardcore, when I was watching that, and I was like, man, it should be so easy to pick out those wines. You see people getting them wrong once in a while, but then when you double blind taste, man, it's difficult. No matter how much experience you have.
Yeah, listen, it's a humbling experience, even for really experienced tasters. Everyone gets it wrong once in a while, and as you pointed out, I mean, so many wines made in so many parts of the world, all technologically, spot on. And let's say they're young, they haven't really started to develop their character. I mean, one wine resembles another, and 500 others. So it's quite easy to get it wrong. And that's why I tell, anyone I'm mentoring for the MS, focus on the wine, not the answer. Don't try and guess what it is right off the top, because you lead yourself down the garden path. We see it all the time at exams. Somebody picks up a glass and thinks they know what it is right away. Oh my God, that's Sauvignon Blanc. And then they don't even touch the wine anymore. They put it down, and then they just hit off their checklist of the textbook, Sauvignon Blanc from XYZ region. And, if they get it right, well, it's sheer luck. If they get it wrong, then they don't even get any points for describing the wine, because they're not focusing on what's actually in the glass. So focus on what's in the glass, and then you use a sort of deductive process, given all these different factors. Here's what it most likely is. Not that it has to be that or is that, but it's most likely. But if you come up with a logical conclusion and you're wrong, I'm happier than if you come up with the right answer, but you have no pathway to get there.
Is double blind and blind tasting, is it actually useful, or is it just a parlor trick? There's this argument as well.
Yes, I think it's extremely useful in that it focuses you, it forces you to focus on what's actually in the glass and not what you think it could be. And you start second guessing yourself, and well, who brought this wine, and what do they like, and what are they most likely to have poured? It really gives you a chance to connect with that wine and understand it. And then what it is after that is kind of even secondary, I'd say.
When do you think it's more useful? Obviously, I have a ton of respect for you. I do it on video because people want to see it. It's entertaining. It's a storyline. There's struggle. There's resolution. There's peaks. I find it most useful when you're studying like a region or a grape variety. Maybe you're looking at the same year amongst producers, so you can take out the bias. Or obviously, vertical tasting is important. The same wine, different vintages. That's where I find it the most useful. I don't know if you want to add to that or even break down my argument.
No, I would say, listen, I'm a wine critic. I'm a wine reviewer. I don't taste blind most of the time because there's just not enough time. After this recording, I'm going to the office. I'll taste 50 or 60 wines, and I need to come up with a decent tasting note that has a little bit of context, a little bit of insight into the region, the grape, the producer, and the experience I have with that. That for me is more useful for a reader, because anyone has an opinion, and give them 2 glasses of wine, they like this one more than that one. That's great. However, I do agree with you. In a specific region, it's amazingly instructive to do a blind tasting. Like, for example, when I go to Kante Classico for the new release in February every year, to do that blind really gives you a chance to compare the quality, the success, or relative success of each producer that year. So, I mean, there you want to remove a little bit of bias and say, okay, I know these estates have done well in the past, but let's forget this. Let's look at this bracket of wines and see which one really sings, which one really speaks to me. Then you make new discoveries. Sometimes you're a little disappointed in producers, but I mean, that's the way it works, right?
Yeah. We're with John Szabo, Master Sommelier, author almost scientist too. Author of Volcanic Wines, Power, Salt, and Grit. I want to touch on what you just talked about. Like, I'm a big fan of all the U.S. publications. I think the one I derive most value out of is Venice. For a while, I haven't been as fervent as a reader lately, but he talked about how he doesn't blind taste when he gives his critic notes and his scores. Uh, do you think you get an equally valid opinion or critic score not tasting blind versus tasting blind?
I do. And there was an article by Terry Tees,
Yeah.
importer of quite well-known German wines, a specialty. And he wrote a really interesting, thoughtful piece a few years ago that stuck with me, kind of around the theme that I was just mentioning. I said, look, I mean, anyone can taste, anyone can say, I like this more than that, but how much context do you have? Do you know this producer? Have you been there for the last 15 or 20 years, as Tees has with many of these producers? And to go in, say, February and say, okay, I've been here in February a few times. I know the wines are always closed at this stage, so I'm going to reserve my judgment for a few months because I know they'll open up, because I've done this. I've been there before. I have context. I have experience, as opposed to one guy or girl who's sitting in their living room and tasting out of a bottle, blind or not blind, without any knowledge of the estate. For me, real expertise, the value, why I would pay for a publication like Venice, or what Tees has to say on German wines, is because these people know, they've been there, they have context. Remember, wine is nothing more than a comparison. If I say to you, this is a full-bodied wine, and you've never tasted wine before, that's completely meaningless. But if I give you two glasses and say, this one's full-bodied, this one's light-bodied, and you can compare, then it starts to make a little bit more sense. And then if you take that 2 and make it 20 or 2,000 or 200,000, then you have real context, and then you can start to make these nuanced, finer judgments. And then, having done that for 20 years in a row, okay, now you've got a whole lot of context. I'm going to trust you more than somebody who says, yeah, I like A better than B.
Yeah, I like how you put that. So it's common sense, but it's articulated super, super well. Really well. I've always thought, as I got into when I first got into wine as a profession, I was like, oh, scoring is easy. You just give an opinion. But then I started to, as I've gotten more into it, I was like, man, I have a lot of respect for people that have I know Bordeaux, but I haven't been going to on premiere for 25 years. I don't know the history of certain producers, of certain benchmark producers, when guys showed up on the scene. And that's where I think the real value comes in, when people with context, because everybody has a palate, right? But context is super important.
Everybody has an opinion. And I'll say one other thing, makes for really, really boring tasting notes. When you're tasting blind and you're tasting all Brunello or Bordeaux or whatever it happens to be. I mean, medium plus acid versus medium minus. I mean, who wants that? I want to know, this comes from this parcel here, which was planted in this year, and there's this vinification technique used. So as a reader, I get to go much more deeply into the wine than know it's a deeper or lighter shade of red or orange or whatever.
I know I found with me, I gave up writing for the most part. I don't write anymore because I knew I couldn't be the best writer in the world, nor did I want to be. But I found I love video, I've loved film, and I found that people find real value because maybe I don't also have the best wine vocabulary in the world, but reactions. I cannot hide my reaction on a face if I'm disappointed or I'm excited, and people pick that out. That's that's like a soft, it's like a soft skill, kind of something that maybe can't be quantified, but I find that it is valuable, even when you're tasting with other people, right? You can't hide emotions on the face.
I mean, lots of different ways to express your emotions, right? You can do
Yeah.
it with words, but physical reactions are so much more immediate.
I want to touch on two kind of personal for both me and you. Maybe something you don't even know. When I started in the wine world, especially because I started kind of my media career in Europe versus America, I never worked on the floor retail. Now I work retail, actually, because I want to gain that experience. But I didn't start that way. I'm going the opposite way. And there were some of the people, not some, most of the people in the business were not very helpful, were really nasty. You were the first person, I think, you were one of the few that was really generous with their time right away and helpful right away. I remember actually our first interactions, I came to your Volcanic Summit in New York City tasting. You didn't even know me, and you're like, yeah, I can get you a ticket here. You're welcome to taste. Uh, you've been around the block in this business a while. Do you find that to be a problem? Is it my experience to be a problem, especially for young people trying to break in?
I'd like to say that it's better now than when I started and when
Yeah,
you started. I'm sure there there are still barriers to entry. There's no question about that.
yeah,
But I look around and I see much more diversity in the wine world. Truly, the number of female sommeliers has increased dramatically since since the 90s when I was starting out, and people of different shades. You see much more of that, which is great, and certainly I do what I can to foster that inclusiveness. And I mean, the wine world has made life difficult for itself for far too long. We overcomplicate things. Wait, let me retract that.
yeah.
I'm not a believer in demystification of wine. I know that's a very popular thing. Bring it to the people. Yeah, it should be brought to the people, but at the same time, it is a complex beverage. Otherwise, why would we be here? Why would we be talking about it for the last 8,000 years? You know, who does a podcast on colas? Why
I
would
mean,
you
there
want
might be
to?
one out there, but I don't know. I don't know how interesting that would be.
Might be not bad from a sponsorship
Yeah, you're right.
perspective.
You're right. There might be a little bit more money in that. Do you think the diversification of voices and opinions is good? And in the past, not even in the recent past, where in the U.S. at least, you had Parker. He was like the guy, Wine Spectator. They were like the opinion. Now there's just a plethora of voices, some good, some bad.
Listen, I mean, it would be great if I could be the Robert Parker of Canada. Uh, for me personally, that would be fine, but it'd be a disaster for the world of wine and for Canadian wine lovers, worldwide wine lovers. I think it's absolutely amazing that there are so many voices now that can reach different audiences. No one person, man or woman, should have the arbitration of taste over an entire generation of people. It makes absolutely no sense. We're all different people, different likes, different backgrounds. We like different food, music, whatever it is. Wine is the same way. To have one voice is an absolute nonsense. Makes it difficult to run a publication, to have a voice with a following and make a living in this industry. That's the more challenging side. But for example, at Wine Align, the publication I write for, we're five critics, and we don't have our silos. She covers Australia, New Zealand. I cover. No, everyone tastes everything independently, post their reviews and their scores independently, and then as a reader, you can align with the critic whose palate matches yours. And all it takes is, okay, you see a wine, five different scores, you go out and buy it, and I rated it highly. You taste it, you hate it. You say, well, I don't align with John. This doesn't make any sense. I'm going to align with so and so, whose palate is obviously much closer to my taste preference. So
Do you
that for me is very, very liberating.
do you find with producers you interacted with that becoming more of the pain in the butt, because then they have to show their what they have to travel more, they have to allow more people to taste, they have to send different samples to different places? Do you find that the producers find that annoying, or they
Hmm.
enjoy that there is diversification? They're not shackled just by one voice, one opinion.
I could give you an analogy that's
Yeah.
very germane to our market in Ontario. We've got the LCBO, which is a government monopoly, or at least
Mhm.
was until very recently. That's another story. But as a
Oh, it's
producer,
not anymore. Oh, okay.
no,
Okay.
we have actual retail shops, and you can buy wine in a grocery store. Can you
Oh,
imagine how
wow.
progressive we are there? It's just incredible. But previous to that, I mean, you're a producer in some part of the world, you send your wine to the LCBO, you hope to get a listing there. If you do,
Yeah.
golden, you can sell pallets after pallets of wine and life is good. But if you're that producer who doesn't get in, well, then you're hooped. There's no other way into the market. Same thing with having one critic all powerful send their wine. If they like it, you're in good shape. You get your big score, you can publicize that. But if you get a bad score, well, then what do? Today you can send wine. I mean, yes, it's more expensive, and it's harder to gain traction, but somebody somewhere in the world will love your wine. So at least you have an opportunity to reach that person.
Do you find Canada's a big market before, and obviously the LCBO, when it was a monopoly, was one of the biggest or maybe the biggest importer in the world. Do you find with all the doom and gloom news in the wine business, like how's the Canadian market? Do you find that it was just a plethora of wine, plethora of backstock, or do you find it more rosy than I guess the media and people paint the picture as?
Yeah, I don't like to spread doom and gloom. Certainly in the industry that I work in, there's no doubt that consumption is down, but not across the board, at least in terms of price segment. We see
Yeah.
more expensive wines, higher end wines doing really actually quite well. Numbers are up in that category. I'd be a little more concerned if I were, a struggling varietal brand in the market, because that's where traction is really starting to slip. And, frankly, do those wines all need to exist? The answer is no.
That's what all the importers here tell. Not all. I'm sorry, just speaking absolutes. A lot of my friends are importers, more boutique, and they say actually, I find actually of having great years with if you're finding a good quality wine, well made at a good price, not cheap, but not ridiculous, not super collector price. That they're really having a great time. I think that alludes to the same thing you were saying. Mostly the cheap stuff's getting washed out, right?
Yeah, I mean, let's have a little shakeout of world wine production, focus on the grapes and regions that do it well, and maybe find a few new ones that will come online, and the rest we don't really need.
I'm going to ask you, speaking about consumption, like this is kind of a personal question. I find myself as I get deeper and deeper down this rabbit hole, and I'm tasting so much like you, I'm tasting a lot of wines, a ton of wine sent to me that I actually am not drinking as much nearly as I used to, especially when I was just a consumer and I was just enjoying it just for fun because you're tasting all day. Did you find that be true, or maybe this kind of went in waves in terms of your personal wine enjoyment? I'm curious about somebody that's tastes as much as you and have been in the industry as long as you
No,
have.
listen, I still enjoy wine with most meals, quite honestly. I mean,
Yeah.
to drink water with dinner seems kind of a sad thing. I have been exploring non-alcoholic wines. Maybe we'll talk about that at another stage. But yeah, you don't always want to bring your work home with you. And like most people in the wine industry, after a long day of tasting, a glass of cleansing ale, as we say, is sometimes much more welcome than I want another glass of wine. No, thank you.
Let's talk about that because so for one of my personal struggles my weight's fluctuated my whole life, especially being a competitive athlete too. Like I've lost about 35 pounds since February, a little over
And you
15
look great, by
kilo.
the way.
Thank you. I appreciate it. You're somebody, as long as I've known you, and I know that you're in a martial arts, right? And you've always kept yourself in shape. That's not the case for a lot of our colleagues in our business. Can you talk about the struggles of, especially because we're around great food and wine all the time?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely critical. I mean, you need to have the discipline. I go out, I train pretty much every day. Rarely a day goes by that I don't do something, even if it's just out for a walk. But usually I'll go for a run or I'll do something in the gym. That's the absolutely critical balance that's necessary when you're constantly around food and wine. Because we know that there's health consequences and they add up over the years. And if you don't look after yourself, well, then you're going to cut your career short. And I would certainly encourage anyone who's in this business or wants to get into this business, find that balance in your life, make the time. You have to, simply put.
I think my mindset changed when a fellow wine writer guy that writes wine, American, he lives in Catalonia in Priorat, wrote an article about changing your mindset. Like especially nowadays, there's going to be better and better wines. You're never going to have a shortage of great wine. So I remember when I first started and it was manageable back then, I was like, oh, I'm getting all this free wine, I'm going to drink it. Now where I'm at, it's completely, even if I wanted to attempt that, it's completely impossible. But I also
and not advisable, I'm sure.
not advisable at all. But I think I've adopted that mindset, especially we'll talk about travel. I mean, like, especially if you're on wine trips or wine press trips, you're throwing so much great food as well, especially when we're in Europe. But just changing the mindset, you know what? I'll always be around great food and wine. I don't need to gorge myself. It's always going to exist in some form, some fashion. I think that's something that's helped me immensely. I don't know what maybe your tips are in terms of
Yeah,
making
I
sure to
mean,
stay
the
disciplined.
the euphoria of those early years of exposure to this wonderful world, they're great, and many people tend to exaggerate a little bit, but you find that balance over time. And as you say, there's going to be another great meal, another great tasting somewhere down the line, God willing. So you learn to moderate in that sense.
So we've seen each other in person, different parts. I think Hungary, recently in Campania in Italy, which recently I just came back from Taurasi, actually. Oh,
Oh,
I
you
just
like
got, I
that's a nice
just came.
wine.
I knew you would like that. Yeah, I actually, so in the US at least, when I moved back, I found it kind of a struggle to connect with some people working in the industry. Now I work retail part time because they've got experience with tasting what the distributors put in front of them and what they know. But a lot of them haven't really been anywhere, any of the wine regions. Where I came from, the opposite. I've been to pretty much all the wine regions of the world, but I hadn't worked retail. They're different skill sets. Can you talk about the role that travel plays if you really, really want to learn about wine?
Listen, it's an absolute privilege to be able to travel and see these regions up live and personal, and kick the dirt and feel the breeze and feel the elevation, or smell the sea. Every region's got its own little bit of magic, and it 5 minutes in a vineyard will replace 500 minutes reading out of a textbook, because it doesn't really come to life in the same way. At that point, it just kind of rote memorization of facts and figures, a little bit dull. But I tell you what, once you've been there, you internalize it in a completely different way, much more likely to remember it. Got this amazing ability to recall experiences like that are much more visceral than simply memorizing facts out of a textbook. So if you have the chance, take it always, because it's invaluable experience.
I love how you just pointed out. I forgot about, sometimes I take it for granted, especially, if we're in the biz. I'm getting invitations all the time. People want me to come here, here, here. So it just becomes, that's like my normal life. It's a little bit weird for people looking from the outside how much I travel, but but I forgot that you tend to remind yourself that it is a privilege that we get to go and experience these places and meet the people and taste things. That's a good reminder.
Well, yeah, absolutely. That's how I feel.
And I'm going to go piggyback of what you said, because textbooks, even some of the great references, like I love Jancis Robinson's books. They're like references. Like, for instance, when I was just in Taurasi, we think of it as a volcanic region, and there was somebody there that was studying locally and talked about in Taurasi, actually, there's not a ton of volcanic soil. There's a lot of clay and low, and we're taught in books, oh, it's a purely volcanic region. And I think it's something that travel teaches you, because the world of wine's so diverse, you can't get everything right. Even if you were writing a book, I learned that when I was writing, you can't get everything right.
Well, don't forget, Matt, that volcanic rocks will eventually turn into clay, as all rocks do. They weather. I'm going to defend Taurasi here for a second,
Okay.
or its volcanicness. I mean, there's no volcano in the immediate environment of Taurasi, but you've got Vesuvius very nearby. You've got
Yeah.
the Campi Flegrei very nearby. You've got Basilicata Vulture right there.
Yeah.
Those all erupted many, many times and dumped a whole bunch of volcanic material pretty much in that entire part of Italy.
Mm-hmm.
So when we say purely volcanic, I mean, I wrote a book on it. I still don't know what purely volcanic is, other than the really obvious places like the side of an active volcano like Etna. But it's been covered with volcanic material for so many eons that how could it not be considered volcanic? It's just really old volcanics. It's weathered into clay.
Yeah.
And there you go.
That's actually, it's so funny. I'll go a little bit deeper. When they were lecturing this, they're saying, to be clear, we're talking about a certain image, a certain amount of topsoil. Like, there's obviously stuff underneath. And thanks for bringing that up. You're right. Volcanic soil will eventually break down into other soils after thousands and
Well,
millions of years.
look at the Willamette Valley in Oregon, for example. You go up there to the Dundee Hills and you see this beautiful, rich, loamy red clay soil. That's pure weathered basalt. It's just 30 million years old, right?
You were producing wine in Hungary, but now you have a new project. I don't know if we could talk about that, because I'm personally really curious about it, and I'll explain why later. Can you tell me a little bit more about transitioning, obviously, from writing critic to actually starting to produce some wine too?
Yes, I can. Don't do it.
Well, I'm not. I don't have the desire to. My
Oh,
my
listen, I
father's
mean,
my father's a farmer. I've worked in it. People don't realize like 1,000 hectares, so 2,500 acres. It's not small. I worked my life in the fields when I was a kid while all my friends were having fun in the summers. It sucked, and I can't even imagine doing that
I
again.
mean, it's hard work. There's no question about it. It's backbreaking. But listen, I mean, I'm a wine critic. I should have some experience making this stuff. Otherwise, what credibility do I have? You know, like a
Yeah.
restaurant critic who can't make an omelet. Like, okay, why are you judging my food if you're not there yourself? So, I mean, that was part of the impetus, but also just to learn and to understand the economics of it, and to feel the pain and the sorrow and the elation that winemakers around the world feel, grape growers at least around the world feel. And plus, I wanted to test out a few of the best practices that I've seen around the world. So, I mean, my vineyard is it's a it's a 1 acre little parcel in Prince Edward County, just
Oh,
outside of Toronto, which is a very cool, very challenging region. I was laughing with a winemaker friend of mine the other day. He said, "Imagine if we grew grapes in like the south of France. We'd be the best fucking growers in the world. If we can grow grapes here, then we can grow grapes anywhere." I mean, it's really like that. But so for my project, the idea is regenerative, no-till, organic. I mean, eventually some biodynamics, but we'll see about that. It's not really the focus right now. And I also wanted to go back to the way pretty much all vineyards were pre-phylloxera, which is to say a field blend. So I
mm.
planted a dozen different all white varieties, cool climate, early ripening varieties, non-aromatic. I didn't want to have Muscat, for example, take over the bouquet of the wine. So they're all kind of neutral-ish grapes, Chardonnay and Chenin Blanc. There's a bunch of Gruner Veltliner and many others beside that. But to build in biodiversity. And then I also planted rows of fruit trees every dozen grape rows or so.
Oh,
So a
you
little,
made it real diverse. Quite a.
you
Are
know,
you? Have you bottled yet? Do you have a label?
no, and that's why I say don't do it, because I mean, it's very cold in the winter in Prince Edward County. We have to put blankets over the vine, geotextiles. But the very first year I planted, we had a night, it was Christmas Eve, won't forget it, minus 32 degrees Celsius, whatever that is in Amerikanski there.
It's
It's
cold.
bloody
That's what,
cold.
if you don't know it is cold.
Yeah, so many of those vines did not survive the winter because they went in young and not established. So I had to replant. And yeah, I've replanted a couple of times, and hope to make the first wine in probably 2 years from now. Maybe a
Do
tiny
you know
bit
what?
that's coming.
Do you know what the name will be? Are you allowed to disclose that? Do you have the name for the
But
estate?
the company name is Promiscuo Wines, in the
Oh,
sort of old Latin sense of promiscuous
yeah.
agriculture, mixed agriculture, as again everything was back in the day. And I don't know. I'll come up with some name for the plot. Right now, it's the Rose Hall Garden Vineyard. My
Okay.
place
Well,
is
I,
in
I gotta
Rose
make
Hall.
it out there. I'm so close. I'm only like 3-4 hour drive. I actually just got sent a bunch of wines from La Côte Jordan, and then also in Escalin and stuff. They gave me a little master class on Niagara. I was like, I gotta make it over there.
Have you
It's
been
always
to Ontario Wine Country?
no, I have
Oh,
not.
we have to remedy that as well. That's
Yeah.
because believe it or not, we're making some pretty excellent wines. I say we.
Yes.
Then
I'm really impressed with some of the stuff I've tasted. So, besides that, any other project? People can find you on Instagram. I'm gonna tag your Instagram, right? That's probably the best way to reach you. Any other kind of projects besides the reissue of the book? Anything else in the works for you?
yes, as a matter of fact, I just started with a new company called the Barrel Hunter Club. It's sort of a community-based, membership-based group of Epicurean, curious people who like to eat and drink and travel. I'm the curator-in-chief for the products that are made available to these Barrel Hunter Club members. And on top of that, we host all sorts of sort of intimate gatherings and larger tastings and collaborative events. I work with guest curators around the world to make collections of wines, sort of modeled after the fashion industry or the museum industry, where you have a limited time exhibition. I'll work with people around the world to put together something around a theme. So we've got one launch underway right now called the Gaudi collection, inspired by Antoni Gaudi, the famous Catalan artist. Made beautiful things in Barcelona, like Sagrada
Yes.
Familia and Casa Batlló. I mean, it's an open-air museum. And yeah, Gaudi was inspired by nature. He said anything that isn't inspired by nature isn't art. Quote of his. So I worked with a woman named Cristina, who lives in Barcelona, and she found a collection of mainly organic, biodynamic, regeneratively farmed wines from in and around the Barcelona area in Catalonia, and under this Gaudi collection umbrella. So that's kind of fun. Get to mix a few different worlds with this club and introduce people to new and exciting things, and see their faces light up when they taste something like, wow, I've never had pica poi from Catalonia. What is that? Why does it taste this way? And get to introduce people to new things, which for me is a great joy.
That and crossing a lot of different genres. That's awesome. I hope to my 2025 schedule's already getting crazy with travel, but I hope to see you in person in 25. Maybe we'll sit down in person and do something like this. But I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
I would love that. Thank you.
John Szabo, Master Sommelier. Thank you so much.